Good evening, everybody. Good evening, also. Thank you all for coming in and we have a super special guest, Miko Peled. I think many of you know who he is, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. He's going to give some different experiences. I'll read his bio in a minute. Just want to really appreciate folks who came out tonight. Just want to take a second because obviously we're all here to learn. And one of the reasons that we're here is there is a genocide being perpetrated in Gaza and throughout Palestine. There are many other conflicts happening as well, so just want folks to kind of take a second. Cool. And thank you. We're really excited. We're going to do basically me and Miko, and I should introduce myself, I guess. I'm Austin. I'm a grad student here, part of the Black Graduate Student Association and the Coalition for Palestine. I think we're going to do basically about an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Miko and I talking kind of one-on-one, and we're going to talk through some questions. And then we're also going to be taking questions throughout. So I think if you go to this tiny URL, you can drop in your questions. And then when we get to that portion, we'll basically kind of pass the mic to folks whose questions have been selected and kind of go down. So let's get into it. So we have here Miko Peled. Miko Peled is an author, writer, speaker, and human rights activist living in the United States. He is considered by many one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine, support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and creation of a single democracy with equal rights in all of historic Palestine. Educated in Jerusalem, Japan, and the United States, Peled is also an accomplished professional martial artist. For 23 years, Peled ran a martial arts school that was dedicated to teaching leadership skills and nonviolent conflict resolution through martial arts. So welcome.
Thank you.
So just to get us started off, and to get people familiar with who you are, could you just tell us a little bit about your background, how you became to be a human rights activist, right? And then what were kind of the moments, the critical moments of your life that led you up to that point?
Sure. Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. Before I say anything, I want to thank the student activists on campus here and on campuses everywhere for the absolutely incredible work that you guys do. Over the years that the Palestine solidarity groups on campuses have been operating, you guys have been able to elevate the level of conversation on Palestine beyond anything anybody could have imagined. And you are really the front line of the struggle. I would say what you do is not solidarity. I would say what you do is a crucial part of the struggle for freedom and justice in Palestine. And my hat's off to you because you're on your own. We all know that the administrations, not just here, but the administrations on campuses do not want you to be there. All the different Zionist bodies that have permanent occupied parts of campuses, as they tend to do, are well funded. They're fighting against you. They're on the attack. You guys have to both defend yourself and also do this important work of being the voice for Palestinians. And as we know, there is no parent to the Palestinian issue. Palestinians are orphans. There's no state that takes care of them. There's no body of states that takes care of them. At best, you have a few little organizations here and there. And your voice and your work on campuses is the only game in town, and you do an amazing job on keeping this alive. And it's not an easy job. I don't know many people who are older than you that would be willing to do it. So again, my hat's off to you, and thank you for doing this incredible, courageous work. And I was telling Austin, I was talking to a friend recently, kind of an older gentleman who's been a DC lawyer for a long time and always fights the good fight. And he was saying there's nothing you can't achieve with brains and courage. And that's precisely where you guys come in, the brains and courage. So keep on doing what you're doing. And I know I'm here for you for anything you need, and there's a whole bunch of other people who are there for you. So use this as a resource. Anything you need, we're here for you. So thank you for that. Now, my background, I was born in Jerusalem to a very patriotic Israeli Zionist family. I wrote a book 10 years ago called The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And that book kind of propelled me into this life of activism. Until then, I had my career. I was kind of, dabbling in activism, but it wasn't something I did certainly not like this, like I do now, which is all the time. And as the book title suggests, The General Son, my father was a general in the Israeli army. And he was a general, and he served in the Israeli army at a very crucial period between 1948, when the state of Israel was established, and 1968, which is like, right after the 1967 war. And the generation of those officers in Israel are like the gods of Olympus. They're considered, unbelievably heroic and so on. And I had other members of my family who were very much involved in the creation of the state of Israel, as the grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence of Israel and so on, and who were also held important positions in the state of Israel in the first few decades. So that was my background. And of course, when you're a kid and you see your dad as a general and all these important people, you think, wow, this is so cool. You're just so proud. And what's interesting is, I've been talking about this a lot lately. Growing up in that environment, at the time that I was growing up, the conversation the adults were having were how do we contribute to the state? The state was the most important thing. It was kind of semi-fascist, really. State, the state, the state. You have to sacrifice for the state. You have to do things for the state. You have to, all that kind of fight for the state. So of course you think you're going to do the same thing as you grow up. And there are several things, as I look back, there were several things in my life that led to me ending up doing what I'm doing, which is, speaking out as clearly as unequivocally as possible against Zionism and against the state of Israel. And it began, I think, with a story my mother told me, which I mentioned in the book. And she told me the story lots of times as I was growing up, and I never really understood why it was important until I wrote the book. And she was telling me, because when she was 22 years old and already a mother in 1948, during the ethnic cleansing campaign in Palestine, the beginning of the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And she was born and raised and lived in Jerusalem, and in West Jerusalem. And during that campaign of ethnic cleansing, the western side of Jerusalem was subjected to an absolute 100% ethnic cleansing. In other words, not a single Palestinian remained, not a single Palestinian family remained, but the homes were there. And the communities, the neighborhoods, the Palestinian neighborhoods in West Jerusalem were still there. These beautiful, beautiful homes. And these were well-to-do, very prominent Jerusalemite families that lived there. And to this day, by the way, when people talk about these homes, they call them the Arab homes. And they usually have an inscription, and there's an olive tree and a lemon tree, and it's very typical, beautiful, stone houses. So she was already a mother. This was going on. These neighborhoods were cleansed, as they say, of Arabs. And she was offered one of these homes, like an officer and so on. And she refused. She said, how can I move into the home of another mother? How can I move my family into the home of a family that has now lost their home and they're refugees? And then she would talk about the looting that took place and kind of with a great sadness about the loss of these neighborhoods that were part of Jerusalem that she knew. And she's a little demented now, so we don't talk much about these things anymore. But as I was working on the book, and until a few years ago, we talked about this a lot. And I remember the story being told to me by her many, many times, and by other people. It was something that I knew, and I never really quite appreciated, but I did realize there was something problematic about the story. Because we're the good guys, so we don't kick people out of their homes. And we don't loot and steal. And yet she was telling, this personal story was contradicting this larger narrative that everybody in Israel, the Israelis learn about, and people hear about it also. So her story was kind of unbelievable in a way. unless you have the entire context, then you understand. And then what's very interesting to me is that when I tell the story, very often there's an older Palestinian in the audience that comes up to me later on and said, we had a home like that in Jerusalem. So thank you, mother. And my point is, what she did was what you'd expect people to do. It shouldn't be unique. It shouldn't be considered exceptional. The fact that other people didn't do what she did is the problem. But when the bar is set so low, obviously if one person does the right thing, suddenly it seems like they're a saint. And she is a saint, don't get me wrong, she's a wonderful person, but that shouldn't be the measure. So that was one thing that kind of led me and was in my mind. Then, after 1967, which I describe as an unprovoked, brutal assault by Israel against its neighbors. My father was a general, and he was one of the generals who planned and executed this assault, which they called the 6-Day War. It was actually a 5-day war. It ended in 5 days, but they called it a 6-day war because in the Jewish prayer book, the term 6 days is repeated a lot. The 6 days, the miracle of creation, that the world was created in 6 days. So there's this connection, 6 days, 6 days. Oh, it must have been a miracle. And I had an interview on my podcast with Phil Weiss from Mondoweiss. I don't know if you guys can deal with Mondoweiss. And both he and I talked about the fact that in America, some of the most educated people who are completely secular talk about that war as though it was a miracle. People don't believe in miracles, but that somehow was a miracle. So they did a really good job in connecting these two things. And so, but then what my father did, still in uniform, the last day of the war, the war just ended. And he stood up and he said, well, now we have an opportunity to make peace and particularly end the conflict with the Palestinian people. And everybody looked at him like he lost his mind. I mean, the intent of that aggression by Israel against its neighbors was to take the land. And somebody's talking about giving back the land. He said, we can return the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians, the Golan Heights to the Syrians, make peace with the Palestinians, they can have their own state, the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as their capital, and we have our own Jewish state, and everybody can, go on with their lives. And his comrades, the other generals, took him aside and said, what the world are you talking about? Why in the world would we do this? And he retired from the military about a year later, and then that was kind of the rest of his life he dedicated to this idea that we know today, the two-state solution. But what's interesting is that as he was saying these words, Israeli bulldozers were destroying Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. They were destroying towns and cities in the West Bank, and heavily building for Jews only in the newly acquired territories. So it wasn't like they said, okay, well, we got these territories, let's try to figure out what we're going to do with them. No, they took them to keep. So I'm kind of going around the story a little bit, but I'll get you. But my father's, suddenly at home, I started hearing about Palestinians. Because until then, nobody said Palestinians, just called them Arabs, or the Arabs of Israel. Some of you who I know are from Palestine. By the way, can I see a show of hands how many people are from Palestine? Okay, thanks. Who's been to Palestine? Anybody visited Palestine? You more. So anyway, so hearing the fact that there were Palestinians, there's a need to make peace with these people and all that, of course, brought me closer to this. And then the final straw, really, and that's sadly the way the world works and the way our mind works. We make big shifts in our thinking and our beliefs as a result of tragedies, terrible things. Sadly, that's kind of the way the world works. And in my case, we had a tragedy in the family. My sister, was a little girl, was 13 years old, and she was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And that's exactly the kind of shock that forces you to see the world in a different light and to question everything you know. And we've gotten accustomed to when we talk about Palestine, to accept violence and move on. It's completely normalized. completely normalized. Like you tell the story about all of this, that, and the other people died, and you move on. Which is why now we know that there's an estimated 50,000 civilians dead in the Gaza Strip, and people just go on talking about all kinds of nonsense, as opposed to saying what in the world is taking place. But so when I talk about that, I say let's stop here for a minute. 3 young men blew themselves up, took their own lives for a cause they believed in, obviously, and took the lives of other people. And what in the world is going on here? What? And we're just moving on with life. So that was a big push for me to get involved and to engage and so on. And eventually what I did was I did engage and I did seek out Palestinian friends. I was already living in the US. So I came back and I began to engage with Palestinians, and then I would travel back to Palestine and drive to Palestinian cities and towns and so on and kind of get myself familiar. And realize that actually, as the subtitle of my book suggests, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, I was actually born and raised in Palestine in a colony called Israel. In this privileged little colony that was imposed on Palestine, named Israel, but it was Palestine. The Palestinians are still there, and that's really the reality. So that's kind of that was the trajectory. That was the journey that led me to this.
Thank you. And I guess building off of that, one of the things that you kind of touched on was even like learning that there are Palestinians, right, as a kid. And I guess one thing that I want to think about, like in the past, you described yourself, and it makes sense based on your family, that you were a Zionist, right? And now you describe yourself as an anti-Zionist, right? And so I'm curious, sort of in also the recognition of Palestine and Palestinians, and thinking about Zionism, what did that mean? What did Zionism mean to you as a kid, or when you would describe yourself in that way? And now reflecting back on that now, how do you kind of see that?
So growing up, because of the environment that I was raised, Zionism was like this amazing thing. It was everything. Zionism and the state was everything. All these important people in my family and the extended family and the people that these people worked with, these like major Zionist figures, the kind of people that you see on money. I remember my son Eitan, we had a great uncle. I had a great uncle who was the president, and at one point his picture was on money, on Israeli money. And I remember Eitan with my son, who also knows him. He was a kid, and I showed him, and he goes, "Oh my God, we have family on money? We're that important." So that was the kind of family that so Zionism was everything, and all these great people and so on. And we really believe that Israelis still do, that this is one of the most important things that happened in human history. And there's this very compelling story about the Jewish people who were in exile for thousands of years, and then there was the Holocaust, and now look what they've done. They turned this desert country into this modern state, and look at what they've accomplished, and on and on and on and on and on. And there's, of course, a big part of the story that's missing. And it's not a coincidence that this part of the story is missing. The fact that, number one, they didn't make the desert bloom, they stole a country that was in full bloom. They didn't build it. They didn't build stuff, they took stuff that was there. And on and on and on. And by the way, they expelled almost 1 million people, took their land, took their water, so no wonder that they were so successful so fast. And so when I began this journey of an Israeli to Palestine, there's a place where, and I remember the moment where I was sitting with Palestinians. I was living in San Diego, and I began to engage with Palestinians, and there were all these dialogue groups at the time. That was like a big deal. And these people who are perfectly intelligent, kind people who I respect and love to this day, the Palestinian community there, were telling me things that couldn't possibly be true. They were telling me that day is night and night is day. It could not possibly be true. And all they were doing is telling me their story, because the premise of these dialogue groups was not to debate politically, but tell your story. And they were very respectful of my story, even though they had no reason to be that kind and respectful, but they were. They kind of adopted me. But then there's a point where you have to decide, could it be that all of these Palestinians got together and decided put together this conspiracy story And they all tell the exact same story in order to lie to me. Doesn't make that much sense. And also during that time, there were a bunch of Israeli historians who rewrote or published about, they're called new historians. They rewrote the history of what took place when Israel was established, basically validating what Palestinians have been saying for decades. But because they were Israeli, and because like Ilan Pappé, for example, he comes from German background, then it's much easier to believe somebody who is not an Arab, because Arabs are biased. So that helped me, a great deal, and I know Ilan, and we've met and we've spoken many times. But there is a point where you have to make a decision to part ways with what you know to be true, and then find a way to something else. And you're like, I think the best way to describe it is like a baby learning to walk, and they hold on to something, and then they need just enough confidence to take a few steps before they can hold on to the next thing. And that gap is exactly where I was. And I always say this, I'm eternally grateful to this Palestinian community in San Diego, who are like my family now, for being, nurturing enough to allow me to take those steps and then find this very safe ground and to reach these conclusions on my own and to understand where I stand. And then rebuild myself as a person. Someday I'm just a new person because everything I knew was not true. Now, when I look at Zionism, to go back to your question, there's no way that as a person who considers himself to be a person of conscience, I could do anything but reject and encourage others to reject Zionism. Because if you don't reject racism, then you accept racism. There's no middle ground in racism. You either reject it or you accept it. Zionism is a racist supremacist ideology. And you look at what Zionism created. It created an apartheid state, and if you don't want to believe Palestinians, and you don't want to believe me, and you don't want to believe others, Amnesty report, last year Amnesty published a report stating very clearly that the state of Israel has been engaged in a crime of apartheid since it was established. So there's a report with data, they've been working on it for years. You should read it, and then print it or send the attachment to your, you can send it to other people, because it's there. So if we reject racism, we have to reject Zionism. If we reject anti-Semitism and white supremacy and on and on and on, then we have to reject Zionism. It's all the same thing. So that was, again, how I ended up, this is how I view Zionism today. And I look at all these figures that I used to admire, and yes, they were racist, and they supported horrific crimes against humanity. That's just a reality.
Yeah. And I think that's something that there was a congressional hearing yesterday, and I think we'll get to that in a minute. But something you said around Zionism and kind of the violence that was required, right, to create the state of Israel. I think we think that you're a human rights activist, you're a peace activist, right? I think we think of peace and in certain can often be super elementary terms, right? In terms of what people call for peace, or maybe duplicitous terms even. So thinking about that, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, I think probably everyone here is thinking this question as well. Do you condemn people who condemn Hamas? No, I'm joking. No, but actually, okay, so coming back, being serious, I think there's something around resistance, right? And how if you believe in peace, if you believe in that people are equal, right? And that there has been violence that has brought the current system, there's a lot of people that struggle, I think, with what resistance is rational, what resistance is allowed, what does it need to be for peace, to accept that resistance may happen. So I'm just curious about some of your reflections there. Obviously, someone who has done a lot of these dialogues, who's been all over Palestine and talked to people. What are kind of your reflections about the role of resistance in the different ways, particularly that maybe Zionism or kind of pits different types of resistance and responds to them as well.
Is this your question? Okay, I've never been occupied and I've never been oppressed. I never have. You know, I'm a white Jewish guy. I've never experienced that in my life. I have very, very close people who are very close to me, who are like my family, who are Palestinians who endure that every single day of their lives. Every single day, every moment of their lives. Actually, all Palestinians endure oppression and terrorism every single day of their lives. I have never had. So I could possibly comment on what they need to do in order to alleviate that horror from their lives. I can only support them, which I do. Now, what the Zionists and their supporters and these, I don't want to use dirty language, I mean inappropriate language, but the people in Congress who were discussing they try to narrow the conversation down to a single moment, ignoring completely where we live. Completely ignoring where we are. So Palestinians have been enduring terrorism, oppression of the worst kind every single day of their lives for 3/4 of a century. Actually, before that, because they had to fight the British before that. But let's say, talk about the versus talk about the Zionist period. Palestinians do not have an army. They've never had an army. Palestinians never had a tank. Never. They've never had a warplane. Ever. They've never had anything even closely resembling an army. They've had small guerrilla groups, which can't compete with the military that Israel has. Israel has always, from the very beginning, had a massive, solid military. Which, if you've been, following my work, you know that I consider the Israeli military to be one of the best equipped, best trained, best fed, and certainly best financed terrorist organizations in the world. But because they have uniforms and generals and tanks, people don't talk about them as a terrorist organization, but that's what it is. Palestinians are, from time to time, now Palestinians have been resisting heroically for a very long time, but the vast majority of the Palestinian resistance has been unarmed resistance. Over the decades, the Palestinians have been enduring this since 1948 and before. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been unarmed, and the vast majority, by the way, of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, who Israel, of course, calls terrorists, have never heard, are political prisoners. Now, is it realistic to expect that a nation that has been so oppressed and on the receiving end of so much violence will never respond with arms? I mean, how stupid does anybody have to be to believe that that's possible? Now, maybe we get into that later, how Palestinians live in different parts of the country under different sets of laws and bureaucracies. But we know that over 2 million people live in the Gaza Strip, which is basically an open-air prison or concentration camp, or however you want to describe it. And the expectation that they would not respond to that and fight against it, even with the small, meager means that they have, is absolutely crazy. It's absurd. So to reject that and to condemn that is the height of hypocrisy. It's the worst kind of hypocrisy. To condemn oppressed people for fighting against the oppression is and congratulate the oppressors as some kind of saviors and saints is the worst kind of hypocrisy. And what's even worse than that is the fact that people like members of Congress, but not only them, anyone you talk to, pretty much the administration and this establishment, support the oppressors. and want to silence people who speak for the oppressed. And they know this. I don't think I'm saying here anything here that is not known by people who are educated. At least, you know, maybe not all, but generally speaking. It is estimated that there are 50, that once the, you know, the destruction is, you know, ends and then people start digging, that the number of casualties in the Gaza Strip over the last month or so will exceed 50,000 dead. 50,000 innocent civilian, I don't know, I mean, the such thing is not innocent, but it's a funny thing to say. 50,000 people dead in about a month. In broad daylight, on prime time, with our money, our tax money, our weapons that are made in this country. And that's not the main thrust of the conversation. That is not what Congress is talking about now. That is not what elected politicians up and down, you know, local all the way to national are discussing, how to end it, how to punish the oppressors, how to punish those who perpetuate this violence. How are they not talking about sanctions? How are they not talking about a no-fly zone over Gaza? How are they not talking about dismantling the apartheid state completely once and for all and safeguarding and demanding guarantees for the safety and security of Palestinians? How is that not the main thrust of the conversation? I don't know. I don't understand. So to condemn anything but the oppressor, to condemn anything but the people who support the oppressor, to condemn anyone other than the people who are pretending and playing this game that the Zionists are forcing everybody to play is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. All of us in this room, everybody who has a heart and a brain to think, needs to condemn Israel and reject Zionism and demand the absolute, you know, dismantling of the apartheid state as soon as humanly possible. I mean, look what they've done. 50,000 record even for that. It's a short period of time, but there's nothing new.
So I want to connect that a little bit. So what you just mentioned, specifically around your second book is about the Holy Land Father, right? And you talk a little bit about that, about kind of the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, how that is sort of weaponized, right, to destroy efforts and even sort of very kind of just aid efforts, right? Not anything necessarily even super resistance oriented, right? But so I guess can you talk a little bit about like the ways that sort of anti-Semitism is used, particularly in this kind of anti-terrorism, national security framework? You mentioned Israel has sort of is the most well-financed, is a well-financed, well-fed, you know, terrorist organization. We know that the U.S., you know, supplies tons and tons of weapons to Israel, tons of money. And so thinking about kind of how those two things work in concert, I guess, are there any, I guess thinking about those two things, are there things that we can, I guess, look for, ways that we can understand how these things get dismantled or how these things get weaponized?
You know, when your entire existence is built on a lie, then you have to defend and prepare all the time for the eventuality that the lie is built. Zionism is built on a lie that's being perpetuated for over 100 years. And whenever the Zionists suspected that somebody was going to expose the lie, they started accusing them of whatever. Anti-Semitism is one thing, but this is what we're seeing now is not new, it's just heightened. When Zionism was established for the late 19th century, you know, but then kind of picked up steam beginning of the 20th century, most Jewish people around the world rejected Zionism. And what the Zionists did is they said, well, these people who reject Zionism, they're not real Jews. So they're not real Jews. Only the Zionists are real Jews. You know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were millions of Jewish people still in Europe. There were large communities of Jews in the Arab world, the Muslim world. And in the year 1900, kind of the group of the most important rabbis of the time got together and published a book in Hebrew that was meant for Jews to read. And it was a warning of the dangers of Zionism to Jews. And basically they said three things. They said this Zionism, this idea of a so-called Jewish state in Palestine, will bring violence to the Holy Land. Check. Then they said it would ruin the good relations between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs. Check. And then they said it would cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jews in the countries they live, because Jewish people are a religious minority that lives all over the world. That's how Jews have been. Check. They predicted this in the year 1900. A lot of people never even knew that Zionism existed then, right? And so the Zionists said, well, so yeah, they have to defend themselves, right? So they said, well, those Jews are not real Jews. And anybody who rejects this is anti-Semitic. And that's kind of been how they educated people, and that's been their campaign. And it's a major part of their campaign, their PR campaign around the world has been based on that. Now, over the last few years, it's become even more serious because threats to Zionism, particularly as people are becoming more aware of what's happening in Palestine and beginning to realize that you can reject Zionism, it became much more serious. So they upped this campaign. They created this new definition of anti-Semitism called the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which is pretty confusing, but basically said if you reject Zionism, you're anti-Semitic. And it was a massive campaign to get government organizations, universities, churches, all kinds of non-government organizations to adopt it. It was a massive campaign. Why does anybody need to adopt it? Why did states, governments accepted it around the world, Europe's over here. And now here we are, where the United States Congress decides that if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. Conflating a racist, completely secular, racist, supremacist ideology with the Jewish faith. What could be more anti-Semitic than conflating these two? I don't know. Conflating Zionism with Judaism is anti-Semitic. And I know so many Jewish people who are, either ultra-Orthodox, or secular, regardless, who completely reject Zionism. So they're anti-Semitic. So it's a completely upside down world. And again, what's crazier than the fact that this is even being discussed is that serious people are actually taking it seriously and talking about it like it's a real thing. How could rejecting racism possibly be anti-Semitic? Think about it. How could rejecting racism be anti-Semitic? Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. You know what I mean? Think about it. How could this is so absurd? But they get away with it somehow. They know how to run these campaigns. And there's a big problem we can talk about maybe later, but there's nobody presenting the other case. There's no serious voice presenting the argument against this. So they have a free rein. If these members of Congress, let's say some of them wanted to make an informed decision, there was nobody presenting them with a possibility to make an informed decision because nobody's presenting them with the other case, with a case against this, which is, of course, one of the bigger problems of the Palestinian issue anyway.
Yeah, and I will say too, I think there were actually a bunch of, or at least a few, MIT students who were part of the Jews for Ceasefire organization, or if not now, Jewish Voices for Peace, who went to DC, right? But because, at least in my perception, the folks that are kind of supporting this anti-Zionism, this anti-Semitism, have a lot of sponsors, right, in the Republican Party in particular. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party, maybe unsurprisingly, is unwilling to sponsor an opposing view, right? to support those people into those halls of power. Which actually brings me to another question, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about things on campus, right? And how, or not just on campuses, but in the US in particular, we can think about the way that we were talking a little bit earlier about the way that the data around anti-Semitism is collected and is created, right? And I think one of the things that comes up is, and is often said, is that, well, Jewish students are afraid to go out, right, currently, right now. And I think, we've, or at least I've always been taught, right, you can't sort of argue with how someone feels, right? Someone feels how they feel necessarily. But I think the challenge, and I feel this particularly, at least as someone who does do a lot of work around racial justice, is, certain people's feelings are valued over other people's lives. Right? And I think one of the things that stuck out, actually, that sticks out from your book, and there's sort of, you talk about in these dialogues, I think that your wife at the time was afraid of you going to Palestinians' houses, right? And afraid that something would happen. And it's sort of, it's a bit, it's funny. It's funny now to look at it, right? And to sit and say, like, she was afraid of you going to this sort of like suburban, probably nuclear family house in like suburban San Diego, right? And afraid of what might happen, right? Even though probably rationally we could say that nothing was going to happen. I guess the question is, how when there is this hysteria, and this hysteria that is not just a lot of people yelling and saying nonsense, but a lot of people yelling and saying nonsense, and that nonsense becoming policy, right? How do you think about countering that, I guess? Or do you think about countering that? Where should we put our focus with this as sort of this looming kind of cloud that's over us right now?
I think that's above the pay grade of students on campus. This is a big thing, and if you want, we can talk about this later, but I'm involved in an initiative to start a place in Washington, D.C. that will begin to do that. Because unless there's a central focus actual location in Washington, D.C. that is dedicated fully to that, it's never gonna happen. It's not something you can do on a volunteer basis, it's not something you can do when you're a student, it's not something that can be done, just, it has to be centralized, well-funded, professionally planned and done properly. It's but until it's done, and until it's done in Washington, D.C., we're not going to see anything good happen in Palestine. And our hopes, our plan, our hopes are that once we get this thing off the ground, we can start seeing change. Within 5 years, we can change the way this competition is being held in Washington, D.C. And that's when we're going to see change in Palestine. Because obviously it takes time. So that's I guess that's my answer to that. I mean, it's not something that, and then the other thing is, we talk about Hillel and all these other organizations that have occupied campuses, and they have a playbook. So the students on that side have a playbook. That's why they do what they do so well. And they create the environment where people come to me and say, well, what do we say when they say this? And what do we say when they say that? And how do we answer this? Well, don't answer any of it. Why do you have to answer the question? Who are they to ask you and demand you to condemn or not condemn, or agree or not agree? Who the hell are they? They're supporting this mass murder of civilians. But they're so good at it, they come at you with this, with this attitude that people feel, like they're pushed to a corner. And so I feel for the Palestinians who are being pushed to the corner, less for the Jews who are, so brittle that they're afraid to walk on campus. Sure, the fear is real, I get it. I have family in Jerusalem and they're also afraid and everything. But where were they when this is happening to Palestinians? If you want empathy, you need to share empathy. If you want people to empathize, you need to share empathy with the others too. You can't always. But I would say the best thing to do in the environment that does exist today, number one, never apologize. Number two, never accept the premise of what they're saying, asking. And number three, they need to answer for what they're supporting first, because we know what Israel is doing. We know, if we take October 7th as an example, as a case. There are all these stories that came out on October the 8th of horrors that the Palestinian fighters were engaged in, and they did this and the other, and a lot of it has been disputed already. But they're saying, I don't know, 1,500 Israelis were killed. What we do know for sure, because of testimony by Israelis who saw it, because of art pieces that were in the Israeli papers, that many Israelis were killed by Israeli army. You know, there was a woman who was there in one of the settlements, and she saw the tanks shelling homes that were filled with hostages and killed them all. We know, again, it was reported several times in the Israeli press that the Apache helicopters, the first day when they came out, they killed without discrimination because they didn't know who was who. So we know for sure the Israelis killed the Israeli army killed a lot of Israelis. We don't know if the Palestinians did or not. We don't know if they did, how many. We don't know yet. We know for sure. You know, there's all this. Somebody said to me in this conversation, so they burn babies in ovens. You know, we know for sure. First of all, we know that that didn't happen. It was refuted right away. But we do know for sure that when a one-ton bomb falls in an apartment building, babies are being burned. And we know the perpetrator of that horrific crime is Israel. So that we know for sure. The other stuff is refuted. If you want to argue, if you want to wait till the jury's not fine, that's where you can wait. Don't pass judgment. Maybe it's not a rumor, maybe it's true. But we know for sure that tens of thousands of civilians, including thousands of babies, were murdered in the worst, most cruel possible way. We know that for sure. So you answer that first. Peled and whatever it is, the mascot for Israel and so on and so on. You first explain to me, how did you possibly respond to that? How did you condemn that? Do you condemn it? And if not, why not? And don't tell me it's Hamas' fault, and don't tell me it's a terrorism fault. That's what you do.
Thank you for the clarity there. I want to come back maybe a little bit to demystifying some things about Gaza and about Palestine. I think you mentioned a little bit earlier about, you know, where Palestinians are located and how, and you traveled around, right, and kind of what that looks like and what oppression looks like in those different places. I think there's a story about kind of entering Gaza, right, in the tunnel, new tunnel, right? So I'd like to hear and, you know, share a little bit about what that experience was like, but then also just about how people are dispersed and located in Palestine and how the ways that people survive are criminalized and demonized when it is just literally how people have to live. And as we've seen on the news, certain things that are called, you know, the Hamas XYZ, right? When many of those are ways that people survive. So just curious about your experiences there, and particularly in the tunnels, but in any way of kind of how you traveled across Palestine.
Well, first of all, I think it's important for people to, I don't know if people know this or not, but the Israeli form of apartheid is unique and very sophisticated. Palestinians are governed by different sets of laws and by different bureaucracies depending on where they live. Now, it's a very small country. And create that kind of segregation in such a small country where very often the communities are literally across a small street from each other, a neighborhood away from each other. You know, you've got to hand it to them. It's pretty incredible. All the way to the point where how much water is given to one side of the street versus the other side of the street. So you have today some 2 million Palestinians who carry Israeli citizenship. Now, their citizenship doesn't look anything like the citizenship I have or any Israeli Jews have. It's a completely different reality. Completely. They live mostly under the watchful eye of the Israeli intelligence services and the secret police. Now, within these citizens of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, there's another step of separation. The southern part of the country called the Nakba. It's the entire southern 50% of the country. There's some 300,000 Palestinians Bedouin live there. And the Nakba is a desert, but it's a very fertile desert. So the Palestinian Bedouins were farmers, and they cultivated the land. Today, they're not permitted to engage in farming. Only Israelis are. So you have Israeli settlements in that part of the country that enjoy some of the highest standard of living among Israelis. And the poorest of the poor among Israeli citizens are the Bedouin living in that part of the country. And we're talking about no electricity, no access to water, no water supply, no roads, no access to medical care, and so on and so on. And again, that part of the country is governed by an independent agency called the Agency for the Development of the Negev, or the Negev. They call it Negev. And development, whenever there's a Zionist agency for development, that means an agency for the displacement of Palestinians and the stealing of their land. That's well known. It's been accepted. That's what development means. They have development of the Galilee, the development of the Nakab, the development of Jerusalem. That's what that means. Getting rid of the Palestinians. Now, again, just talking about the Nakab, the southern half of the country, where there's 300,000 Palestinian Bedouins. Over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been about 2,500 home demolitions per year. So within 4 or 5 years, that's 10,000 homes demolished. How many do you imagine of these homes that were demolished were homes of Jewish Israelis? Anybody care to guess? Yeah, nothing, zero, not even one. Could it be that only Palestinians built without a permit? Because that's the excuse, that they built without a permit. Could it be that Israelis never ever built without a permit? They follow all along? I mean, I know it's not true because I know people who, they had a balcony and they turned it into a room. Or added a floor or whatever. And they didn't bother to get a permit, so if they were caught, I don't know, whenever that happened, an inspector came by and gave them a fine, and then maybe they paid it, or maybe they went to court, and a few years later, they dealt with it, or they didn't deal with it. That's how it works. You never see the police or the army close down the street, bring bulldozers, and give a family 5 minutes to leave before they destroy their home. You never see that ever for Israeli Jews. That is only, now I'm talking about the citizens of Israel, I'm not talking about the West Bank or Gaza or not even Jerusalem. And then there are some 40,000 home demolition orders for the Palestinian citizens of Israel who live in the other half of the country, the northern half. Now, it's the demolition order, my Palestinian friends tell me. Because I've never lived with a demolition order, all right? Is worse than having your home demolished, because you don't know when it's gonna happen. It's like having this cloud over your head. You have kids, you have babies, you have children, you have a family, you have a grandparent, whatever. You don't know. They might come at 2 o'clock in the morning with the bulldozers. You don't know. It's almost worse than actually having the home demolished. And there's no city planning for Palestinians. All the city planning is for Israeli neighborhoods and towns only. There's no city planning. There's no infrastructure plan for Palestinians in any of the cities. I'm talking about just, again, only the cities where the Palestinian citizens of Israel live. And the conditions in some of these cities are far worse than they are in the West Bank, for example. I mean, it's horrifying. Then you've got the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, and they have their own special ID, which is kind of like a permanent residence or alien residence. Now, I have friends who come from families that have an 800-year history in Jerusalem. Families who have been living in Jerusalem recorded 800 years, 500 years. Well-known families. I have more rights there than they do. Because that idea that they have, this permanent resident thing that they have, can be taken away. I can go back tomorrow, I can live in Jerusalem if I like, no problem. My grandparents immigrated 100 years ago. They've been there for 800 years, their families. They have entire sections of the city named after them. I'm not talking about just one. There's a whole host of Palestinian families like that from Jerusalem. Jerusalem families are like, you know, the cornerstone of Palestinian society in many ways. So that's a Jerusalem. Then you've got the West Bank, and they live basically under military rule, but they chop the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. And then you've got the city of Hebron, which has H1 and H2. And on and on and on and on and on, all these crazy, crazy bureaucracies that make life absolutely hell for Palestinians. Restrictions and more restrictions and laws and requirements and restrictions and laws and requirements, on and on and on. And everything you do, you pay a fine. And anything you want, any permit that you need in order to overcome these bureaucracies, you have to pay. It's a huge industry. And then you've got over 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip in a prison, in a concentration camp. And then you've got millions of Palestinians languishing in camps outside of Palestine. And they're denied the right to return because Israeli law prohibits them from going back to their homes. So that's how the Israeli apartheid system is. And like I said earlier, probably one of the more sophisticated aspects of this is the water. Israel controls all the water. Israel is an agency called Miko, which exports its expertise to make the desert bloom around the world. And they control all the water. Now, between the river and the sea. Yesterday I was at an event at a library in New York, not the city of New York, near Albany, Bethlehem, New York, actually. And during my speech, the administrator, the director of the library, was coming towards me and said, "You can't say that. You can't say that over to the sea, or I'm going to have to close down the event."
Don't worry, it's MIT. From the river to the
Palestine. So, river and the sea, the River Jordan and the Ukrainians, which are the boundaries of the country of the sort of Palestine. There are about 12 million people, about 7 million Palestinians, and about 6 or so million Israelis. Well, there's about 1 million more Palestinians now, and it grows as we speak. Because Palestinians have more children. And so, Palestinians, who are the majority, are allocated 3% of the water supply. Let that sink in for a minute. The majority of the population are allocated 3% of the water supply. And sometimes we're talking about 2 neighborhoods across the street from each other. So one side, Israeli Jews, I never thought about water. You want to drink, you want to take a bath, you want to go to the pool, you want to water the lawn, you never thought about it. Palestinians get whatever, sometimes 10 hours of water supply per week, sometimes 15, and they don't know when it's coming, when it's not coming. If they do get water, then you have to save it, you have to restore it, you have to do something because you don't know if you're going to have water the next day, and on and on and on and on. That's a level of sophistication of segregation that is unbelievably demonic. So that's the reality. That's the apartheid.
I think you broke down really well this kind of bureaucratic settler colonialism that exists in the super complicated ways that when we're taught, and you saw, for those of you that watched the hearing, probably saw the ways that the Congress people were trying to conflate critical race theory and DEI and all those words that people that they hate, and like education, with anti-Semitism and genocide, right? In order for people not to understand and not to critically think about how these things work, because if it's not slavery, then it can't be racist, right? Basically, it's how things fucking down. I want to remind people, I'm going to ask one more question. Remember to submit questions here, and then I think we can transition to that. But maybe for just a last question, at least for me, thinking about the way that the settler colonial apparatus exists in Israel and has existed, right, for many years. And then thinking about the last 2 months, you have, for a while, I think since you've been doing activism, kind of focused on this idea of a single democratic state, right, with equal rights in historic Palestine. Right? And so I'm just curious now, where we are kind of, early December 2023, has anything changed? Either in, not necessarily in the goal of where you think things could go, but in how we get there. Have you noticed, or, no, I don't want to ask you if you're more or less optimistic, but just what are your reflections on how we get to a place? I think before we were talking a little bit about like, we're so distracted by all of these things, people, you know, the powers that be distract us away from the actual solution and how do we get to peace? And how do we get to a durable and a just peace, right, and an equal peace? So I'm curious kind of on your assessment over the last couple of months, where has that changed anything and where do you think we go from here? Small question.
Well, look, October 7th was a watershed moment. It's one of those moments where everybody's gonna remember where they were when they heard about it. It's a watershed moment. And what we did see, and just kind of recap very quickly, we saw fighters coming out, Palestinian fighters coming out of one of the poorest and most oppressed places on earth. And they were able to not only occupy half of Palestine, but completely paralyze the state of Israel for weeks. In fact, it's still paralyzed. And even Israeli generals were praising the abilities of these Palestinian fighters, how they were able to do this, and how they were able to train, and how they were able to put all this together. You know, they came by air on gliders, they came by sea, they crossed, you know, they walked across. I mean, it was a major operation. And it was very successful. Like it, don't like it, that's not the issue right now. And they managed to paralyze the state of Israel and expose what I actually believed was the case anyway, that the Israeli army is merely a paper tiger. The Israeli intelligence services are complete fabrication, they're enormous abilities. And that the state of Israel is, and a sense of security that Israelis had, and the sense of entitlement that they had within this structure. They're scared. They you know, they're terrified because everything fell apart. Now, the state of Israel, like any gangster that was humiliated, needed to take their revenge on something. They can't fight the Palestinians because the Palestinian fighters are better fighters. Woo! And we've seen this over and over again. So what did they do? And by the way, the Palestinian fighters are not an army, they don't have tanks or bullets. Talking about a bunch of guys in sweatpants and semi-automatic. Okay, with a limited number of bullets. So what do? They take it out on the weakest, most defenseless people they can find, which are civilians in Gaza, and that's how we end up with what today's count. Like I said, the Palestinian Ministry of Health, you know, kind of downplays the number, so there are about 20,000. It's expected to rise to about 50,000. But that's what they did. I mean, like a gangster, like a bully who has to take it out on someone. They went and they decided they're going to murder as many people as possible, just to show. While the fighting still goes on, in other words, that didn't affect the fighting that goes on, and Israeli soldiers were being killed between the fights too. So that hasn't solved anything, but they feel better about themselves. The Israelis are pleased, and Netanyahu, the government feels good and strong. And so the fact that we saw all this happen over the last month or so, month and a half, you know, this presents us with an opportunity. Problem is, there's no parents to the Palestinian cause, so there's nobody to make demands. And even the best intentioned people today are accustomed, for some reason, when it comes to Palestinians, we should always request the very, very bare minimum and be grateful if we get half of that. That's the mentality. Ceasefire. Please, 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 ceasefire. The bare minimum. And then Israel agrees to a couple of days and then goes on bombarding again. And that is a massive failure, I think, on our part. This is an opportunity to say categorically that this vicious apartheid state has no legitimacy and must be dismantled and replaced with a free democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. Blood is spilled before people stand up and demand what Palestinians deserve. What more sacrifice do Palestinians need to show? What more courage Palestinians need to show? What? What more needs to happen before we stand up and we have 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. dismantling the apartheid state now, not tomorrow, not next year, right now, and sanctions against the state of Israel right now. There's not a single Palestinian. Instead, what are we talking about? Anti-Semitism, Zionism, not Zionism. Who gives a damn? Palestinians are being murdered everywhere, not in Gaza, only in Gaza, by the way, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. Palestinian citizens of Israel are living a life of terror. What more needs to happen before this demands are being made? Now, there's no parent to the Palestinian cause. There's no state. There's no group of states. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa, you have the ANC, which was a force to be reckoned with, the South African Communist Party, the Soviet bloc, Cuba, who sent tanks to Angola. You know, Palestine is nobody. Nobody. It's not just the West, BRICS too, except for Brazil and South Africa a little bit. All the other BRICS countries are with Israel and Africa and everybody else. We are the ones that have to do this. When we go out and demand, what is this? Who made this crazy decision to call for just ceasefire? What does that even mean? Look at the history of ceasefires. Israel has violated every ceasefire agreement it ever signed. What is this about ceasefire? Please, just for Israel makes things worse. The demand is for it to just pull back a little bit, and that's it. We forget how much worse, how bad it was, because now it's it's a little bit less worse. It's absurd. This is the time to demand that not a single Palestinian child be hurt anymore, ever again. There has to be a political resolution. There has to be a permanent political resolution to the question of Palestine that will guarantee, first of all, the safety and security of Palestinians, and then guarantee that this will never happen again, and guarantee freedom and justice for Palestinians, and guarantee the dismantling of the apartheid state and replacing it with a free democratic Palestine with equal rights. And that is the recipe for peace. That is the only recipe for peace. Only a free democratic Palestine with equal rights can lead to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. As long as the apartheid regime remains, there can't be peace, because the apartheid regime, or anybody who's what they call pro-Israel, all they want is privilege for Israelis at the expense of Palestinians. Israel never wanted peace. Peace has never been part of any strategic objective of the state of Israel. Quite the opposite. And they made it very, very clear very early on. And even if they didn't say it, look at what they do. So peace has never been an objective. There can never be peace as long as this continues. This is nonsense. The only recipe for peace is, like I said, dismantling the apartheid regime and replacing it with free democratic Palestine with equal rights. Then peace between the two people can is probably, I think, inevitable. But not to call for sanctions, not to call for a no-fly zone over Gaza, not to throw out every Israeli diplomatic mission back to where they came from, to allow Israel to participate in the Olympics and in academic arenas and cultural places. Are we out of our minds? And for an American politician to not be ashamed to associate themselves with Zionism, and we vote for them? What, are we crazy too? Why would anybody vote for a politician who is willing to associate themselves with this violent, racist ideology that produced this horrific crime against humanity? So this is where we need to be. This is the conversation that we need to be having, and we need to be pushing this conversation in every arena, at every opportunity. Nothing less than that.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want to call out before I pass it over to get questions, and we're going to take questions. We have about 30 minutes. So we're going to take questions 3 at a time, I think, and then you go can answer them. For folks, as Miko was talking about, dismantling the apartheid state and sanctions and boycott and divestment. The Coalition for Palestine a few days ago launched a pledge. So everyone here who's an MIT student or associated with MIT, you can sign that pledge. It's at, I believe, caa.mit.edu/pledge. You can pledge to withhold your labor, your research, and your efforts from any companies, right, that benefit from apartheid or benefit from or work within kind of the apartheid state and an occupation. So just want to encourage folks to look at that, to sign that if you're here, to really do what we can to work towards that. So I'll pass it over to
I want to be mindful. Thank you so much, Miko.
Sure.
It's so wonderful hearing from you. I want to be mindful of time. We did get about 50 questions, so for the sake of
I don't blame you.
of course. So we've chosen the first three to ask their questions. If Prahlad would please come step to the side here, as well as Richard Solomon and Michelle DeGraff. If you wouldn't mind just making your way to the side, and then that way we can have a bit of an efficient question.
Thank you so very much for we needed that after yesterday in Congress. We needed that. So yesterday was such an example of a willing use of language. So from the very beginning, the way that there was this moment of silence to recognize the Israeli victims and others, not to worry about Palestinians. And there was some pride when Congress of MIT, when she mentioned Palestinians by name. That was quite courageous of her. But throughout your talk here, you mentioned the use of language, 6 days war, and when we think about, for example, the very use of anti-Semitism or Judaism being equated, so that too is the use of language in order to cement Zionism. And I was thinking about the role of Hebrew. So you, yourself, you're a son of a Zionist. So I was curious about how Hebrew itself was used in cementing Zionism, in cementing this notion of Zionism equal to Judaism.
yeah, all of them.
Yeah, keep going.
So my question was related to propaganda. And the question I guess now is, what mode of communication or information spreading is the most effective to cut through propaganda? Have you found that social media, for example, now is a much more potent tool than it was, or well, I guess it didn't exist maybe 20 years ago, but 20 years ago. But yeah, what would you recommend would be the mode of communication?
Hi, my name is Richard. So there's a tradition of cultural Zionism that's distinct from the political Zionism of Theodore Herzl, or the religious Zionism of Rabbi Cook, and the labor Zionism of Histadrut and all that. And the cultural Zionists, people like Martin Buber and Ahmed Haram and others, they saw Zionism as a spiritual and cultural revival for the Jewish people, as a recovery of the Hebrew language. And I wanted to ask, do you think of that tradition? Buber also called for a binational state. Do you see that as kind of a healthy off-ramp for Zionists to begin thinking about Jewish sovereignty in a more egalitarian way? Or do you think of cultural Zionism as just a cultural front for the same kind of ethnic nationalist project?
Okay, let's do just three and then we'll go on from there. So interesting, your question about the use of Hebrew. I was talking about this yesterday. So, you know, the Zionists is very angry when you say secular colonialism. Or when you say occupation. But that's only true in English. In Hebrew, these words are and these concepts are held there, like, you know, on a huge pedestal. And I remember I was meeting a friend of mine, a Palestinian friend, near the city of Jaffa. And he said, let's meet on Occupier's Hill. That's the name of the place. There's a big parking lot there, and we were gonna meet there. I said, what did you say? Of course, he said it in Hebrew. You know, I have another friend that lives on Settler Hill Road. In Hebrew, the terms settler, colonizer, occupier, conqueror are used all the time. Every other street, every other, you know, everywhere. It's like we were the pioneers. Like it's a really great thing, but don't you dare say it in English. Don't you dare say it in English. In English, it's not allowed. You know, it's really it's fascinating. Even the name Israel. You know, the South Africans didn't get it right. Apartheid is an ugly name. It's easy to be against apartheid. How could you possibly be against Israel? It's biblical. It's messianic. It's glorious. And people still talk, you know, people still have a hard time saying, what do you mean Israel has no right to exist? I say, well, Israel is the name they gave to the apartheid system. Don't be dazzled by the name. Look at the system. Look at what they did. No, you can't. It's the people of Israel and it's Israelites and it's all of that. Get over it. That's got nothing to do with it. They just have a really good public relations campaign and they named it Israel on purpose. They knew what they were doing. They knew how hard it would be to reject for Jews and for non-Jews. I mean, Zionism was actually a Christian invention before the Jews took over and made it their own thing. So yeah, the use of the Hebrew language, and what they did was so for example, ultra-Orthodox Jews reject the notion of modern Hebrew because Hebrew is supposed to be a sacred language used only for prayer. And I'm working on a book now about the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist community, so I spent a lot of time with them in New York and in Jerusalem and in London and a few other places. So I went to synagogue with them. And the prayers are written in Hebrew, so I can read it. But the way they pronounce it is like it's a completely different language. I have no idea what they're saying, you know, which is very interesting. So yeah, absolutely, the modernization of Hebrew lends itself to this notion, the notion that the Zionists have created, that the Jewish people are a people with a common language, and a people with a common country, and a people with a common history, as opposed to religious minority that lives all over the world and is united by their faith. And of course, the use of the Hebrew language is a big part of that. And it was a campaign. I mean, when both my parents were born in Palestine in the 1920s. And as teenagers, there were these radical zealots. And if the immigrants who came, the Jewish immigrants spoke their own languages instead of Hebrew, they beat them up. How dare you? They terrorized them. Don't speak all these, you know, other languages. You are a Jew, you must be Hebrew. You're a Hebrew, you must be Hebrew. So yeah, the use of the Hebrew is heavily used by the Zionists to promote their you know, to promote their shenanigans, to promote their lies. I don't know what the most effective way to promote, I think the most effective way is, to promote whatever campaign you want to promote is, I think it's the Parthenon, you know, approach. You need to have lots of different pillars. It's not just one. You have to use everything that you're, and look at what the Zionists have done. For over 100 years, they've been working extremely hard and have invested a lot in influencing every aspect of life. Politics, education, culture, philanthropy. I mean, you name it. You know, I was telling the story. I lived in San Diego for a very long time, and in San Diego, the biggest philanthropist in San Diego are the Jacobs family. They own Qualcomm. And never mind the football stadium is called Qualcomm Stadium. But every library is, you know, every school has a Jacobs building, Jacobs library. I mean, they give so much money to so many good causes. They saved the San Diego Symphony. They gave them a huge endowment. Now they're Zionists. Now, such a good family, such wonderful philanthropists, so you're gonna tell me that Zionism is bad? It couldn't be bad, it couldn't be Zionist if Zionism is bad, it's just good people. You see how this works, you know? So they used every means possible for going back 100 years, more than 100 years. And so it's not just that there's an Israeli lobby in DC, a bunch of guys and women in suits at the offices there in DC. They're everywhere working on it. You know, education. You know, there are Zionist nonprofits in different various states checking what goes on to social studies textbooks in middle school. And making sure that the right words are used to describe what is happening in Israel, in Palestine. And on and on and on. So you have to use everything you got. You know, print, social media, lectures, events, you gotta use everything. But what the Zionists have done very skillfully is they have a singular message. So all the differences between them, all the arguments between them, and there are a lot of them, stay in-house. Outwardly, on the issue of Israel, on the issue of Palestinians, there's one voice. You know, they've been very good at that, and that's why there's a playbook. That's why every, you know, anyone that's involved in this on the Israeli side, on the Zionist side, knows exactly what to say, what to ask, what to answer, boom, 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 boom. They've got the playbook. This river to the sea thing, look how fast it happened. I mean, a few days ago, I didn't even know it was an issue. Suddenly it's a national issue. It's a major anti-Semitic issue. You know, that's how effective they are, and everybody's on board. Every kid on the campus, everybody in high school, everybody's on board. The president, everybody suddenly doesn't like the river to the sea. It's that effective, but they use everything they've got. Now, the question of cultural Zionism comes up a lot, and I think what we see, if we look at the history of the state of Israel, kind of the internal politics, those guys were kicked out and pushed away very quickly. Nobody wanted anything to do with them, you know. There was a small group with Mark Buber, like you mentioned, and so on, that kind of believed in some kind of an egalitarian idea, blah, blah, blah. You know, nobody took them seriously. The real, you know, political Zionism took over, and that was the end of it. And historically, again, as we look at the history of the internal Zionist politics within the state of Israel, any voice that seemed like they might be slightly less aggressive was pushed out very quickly. You know, there are many examples. You know, I'll give you the example of my father. He was you know, highly regarded. You know, he was a general of that generation that everybody thought were gods. You know, and in the meetings of the Israeli High Command, you know, their own meetings, but also in the meetings with government, with the prime minister and so on, he was one of the strongest voices calling for war. You know, they even called it a coup, like there was a general's coup and all kinds of stuff like that, calling for war. My book, where he's still a young officer in the 1950s and he's giving a talk in front of some Jewish Zionist dignitaries, and he's saying, we are waiting for the order to push Israel's eastern boundaries to its natural place, which is the Jordan River. That was to take the West Bank. It's just a matter of time. You know, we're just waiting for that to happen because that's what needs to happen. Then, when he started talking about the two-state solution, negotiating with Palestinians, he became a pariah. My parents had no more friends. People that they knew for, you know, all these, not only the military friends, but even, my parents had no more friends. It was done. How dare he talk about this small idea of a peace, you know? Tiny little idea of a peace to give the Palestinians a fraction of what they deserve, and you know, and the reward would be, you know, Israel could live in this, you know, this high, pie in the sky liberal Israel could exist, you know, and he's only one example. So Zionism, there's one Zionism, and it's political Zionism. All these other attempts to try to soften it a little bit and make it seem slightly more palatable couldn't succeed. They couldn't succeed because there are no shades of racism. There's no shades of settler colonialism. You either reject it or you're with it. And that was the end of it. And all these people remained and lived as good citizens of the state of Israel. Even through, that was the third one, right? Even through one.
you please have Sophie of CAA, Amy staff, and Jessica from Grads for Palestine to please come and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, how do you reconcile with the fact that so much of your family held Zionist beliefs? And what advice do you have for those of us who've been trying to engage in dialogue with Zionist family members, friends, etc.?
Oh, boy.
I think it's still worth asking the questions. Most people might be resume. This question is, how would you suggest we go about initiating and framing dialogue with others who are there are evils on both sides, who are interested and curious in hearing more from both sides, especially those who come from Zionist families? How do we have these conversations? So it's very similar to the first one. And
So how do we have conversations with?
People believe that there are evils on both sides.
And the last question is, you mentioned the importance of American political animus on giving Israel its immunity. But when we talk to people in our lives who consume only mainstream media, example, Fox News, it seems like swaying public opinion is impossible. They say the evidence justification that you provide for your beliefs are fringe theories or ignore it altogether. What do you recommend we say to that? I feel like I'm at an impossible stalemate with my Christian Zionist family and their community.
Yeah. So the family one is a tough one. So there's a story that I always tell. And that I heard many years ago and I appreciate it. So during the Civil War in Nicaragua, at one point, the president of Nicaragua, Chamorro, she had family members on both sides, Sandinistas and Contras. And they were killing each other. Violeta Chamorro, I think. Violeta Chamorro. Sunday dinners, everybody left their weapons outside and the entire family came together. That was it. They stopped killing for that afternoon, that evening, they came together and they ate their Sunday dinner as a family. I like that idea. And that has been kind of my guiding light with my family. So when I'm in Palestine, and until recently I was there a lot, and many times every year, Friday night, 6 p.m., family dinner, that's it. I'm there with my family. And we don't talk about it because we can't talk. I can't tell them where I've been, I can't tell them what I've done, I can't tell them what I've seen, even though I'm like, coming from this reality that, and they don't want anything, they don't want to know anything about it. But it's a choice I made. I either have a family or I don't have a family, and that was a choice I made. And my, my kids have a relationship with a family and so on and so on. And that held, for years. Until October 7th. October 7th, something happened. And so now it's not working. It's not working for them, not for me, for them. And so the dislike of my voice since October the 7th is so severe that that's it. It's done. There's no relationship. It's finished. We'll see if it's ever restored. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's a choice that has to be made by everybody involved. That you either maintain a relationship and limit it to whatever it is that you do as a family, or the whole thing explodes in your face and there's no family. Now, it's not an easy choice. It's not a pleasant kind of a thing, but it's the only choice we have when we are in this kind of a position. I hear this question from a lot of people, a lot of young people who have families who are Zionists, and some of these young people only realized this yesterday. suddenly, they have these arguments with their families or their parents and so on, and what do you do? Well, you have to make a choice. Everybody involved has to make a choice. You respect the boundaries, you respect what the other person thinks, and you keep the family, or you go and close up. That's the only way, those are, as far as I found, but those are the two options. But certainly since October 7th, things that have reached, the polarization has reached a whole new level. And it's very hard to reconcile. I mean, it's extremely hard to reconcile. And if you figure it out, anything better than that, I'd be happy to hear. I don't, how do you initiate dialogue with people who think that there's evil on both sides? I mean, it's kind of a bumper sticker thing. What do you mean evil on both sides? I don't know what that means. What do you mean evil on both sides? It's kind of a cop-out approach, I think. There's no evil on both sides. We're talking about a very particular issue, a very particular set of, very particular history, a very particular reality. I don't even know what that means. So, if you bring it down to, well, do you accept racism and violence, or do you reject it? It's simple as that. And for me, that's the basic premise. When people say, yeah, there's evil on both sides, I go, okay. I don't accept that. I really don't accept that. This is a very, very simple. It's very simple because it's about values. It's not about religion. It's not about politics. It's about values. Do you accept racism and violence, or do you accept, humanity and the possibility of peace? These are two options. And then you follow your values. When there was this, I've said this many times before, but it came up when they were discussing the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. And they were justifying what was being done, they're bombing hospitals and all that. Not only Al-Shifa, other hospitals were bombed. And I had this conversation with Zionists years ago, another time that they were bombing in Gaza. And this is how I see it. Let's say the devil exists in a tunnel under the hospital. The devil. Does that justify harming a single hair of a child? That's the only question that matters. How that is answered is the only thing that matters. Anybody who says, yes, but, anybody who says that it's justified, I got nothing more to say. I'm done with the conversation. Anybody who can tell me that it justifies harming the hair on the head of a child, I'm not even talking about the life of a child, because the devil is in a tunnel somewhere. I can't talk. That's it. The conversation's over as far as I'm concerned. Because it's a question of values. Question of values. You reject racism or you accept racism. And Zionists will usually say yes, but I reject but. There's no but on this issue. So that's my yeah, Christian Zionism and so there's two parts I think to the third question was something about swaying public opinion. You can't sway public opinion without the tools to do it. You need to have strategy, you need to have money, you need to have professionals doing it. It takes a long time. It has to be done properly. It's not going to be done by all of us, posting on social media. Well, it's nice to keep in touch, but that is not how we do it. It has to be, magnified by gazillion before it has. And Christian Zionists, they invented Zionism. The saying in the land without people for people without land. That was the Christian Zionists saying that before the Jewish Zionism was established. And this notion that the Jewish people are a nation, that they're related to this ancient tribe, the Hebrews that lived in Palestine thousands of years ago, these are all Christian ideas that the Zionists adopted and then made their own. The Jewish Zionists adopted and then made their own. So it's tough under crack, but I don't know that we need to engage in that. I know that it's important to convince them. If they believe that there's a God that thinks that this is okay, I don't know what to say. It's the same thing with the Shifa hospital thing. I wouldn't bother trying to convince anybody. It's not about that. I think presenting the arguments against Zionism and presenting Palestine as a legitimate entity with its history, with the rights for Palestinians, with what Palestinians have been going through the last 100 years and so on, that's important. And then people will make, I think eventually people will make the right decision presented with, when they're presented with, the truth. But to convince people who believe all these messianic things, I don't know. I don't know that it's worth the effort.
Do you want to do maybe one, is there one more question or?
I can do one more question, my voice is about to.
I do say before you get to the question, I do want to say one thing about what you just mentioned around kind of swaying public opinion versus other things. I think we would be remiss if to say like the reason that we're sitting here right now is because students on this campus have not necessarily worried about just sending out only, there's many different struggles, but sending out op-eds and posting on social media and doing all those things, but like actually decided to get organized, right? Even well before October 7th, right? But long and actually decided to get organized, to talk to people, to come together, to push things together. And that's the only reason we're here in the first place, right? And able to do that.
So this is the final question from a student. What organizing efforts have been successful in your experience for getting other Jews who don't call themselves anti-Zionist to support the Palestinian cause?
I don't understand. I mean, how can you be a Zionist and support this Palestinian cause? I mean, that's an oxymoron. So saying
Just not there yet, I think is the idea of the question.
they're not there yet?
Yeah,
Well, they're not there yet. I don't know. Time to join, they can make a decision. What more? Now, what more needs to happen before people are there? I mean, I don't know if they need to allow them to, feel whatever it is. You know what I mean? And on one hand, I know this is the end. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank you guys for organizing, for standing up, doing the right thing. When Palestine is free, as it will be, and you guys will be able to put yourself, your kids, and your grandkids, you made it happen. Because your contribution is important beyond anything you can even imagine. Thank you very much.